Local fake cops dragged my wife off our porch. Didn't know she was CIA and already had entitled people. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. The sun had just begun to dip behind the rows of neat, identical houses, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban street. Birds chirped from the trees lining the sidewalks, and the gentle hum of lawnmowers mixed with the distant sounds of children playing. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where the most exciting thing that happened was a yard sale or a new family moving in. The houses stood like sentinels, perfectly manicured lawns stretching out in front of them, each house a testament to suburban peace and normalcy. At the corner house, nestled in the middle of it all, was a small but cozy home where the protagonist lived with his wife. To any outsider, they were just another couple, leading an unremarkable life. He worked from home, the steady tap of his keyboard a constant companion. His wife, on the other hand, stayed out of the limelight, content in her routines, grocery shopping, picking up coffee in the mornings, tending to the garden. She had a soft smile that made people feel comfortable around her, an air of kindness that put others at ease. Their life seemed like the perfect picture of suburban serenity. But there was something about her that always felt just a little bit off. She moved with a grace that seemed too practiced for someone so seemingly ordinary. Her eyes, though warm and welcoming, often carried a distant glint, as though they were constantly observing the world from a different angle. People who had known her for years couldn't quite place it, but there was a subtle unease when they tried to probe deeper into her past. She had a way of deflecting questions about herself, offering just enough to keep others satisfied but never truly revealing the whole picture. It was as though she had lived 100 different lives before settling into the calm of this small, quiet street. Her husband, of course, didn't think much of it. He had always known her this way, and after all, everyone has their secrets, right? He had his own busy world to navigate, and the peace of their home was all that mattered. Little did he know, the calm would soon be shattered, and those hidden parts of her past would be the key to everything that was about to unfold. It was a bright Saturday morning when the peace of the neighborhood was disturbed. The usual hum of life, mowers running, children playing, was interrupted by the sudden arrival of two men in dark suits, stepping out of an unmarked van parked awkwardly along the curb. They didn't belong to any of the usual groups that typically wandered through the neighborhood. No, these men were different. Their clothes were too crisp, their movements too deliberate. It was almost as if they had rehearsed the scene they were about to play. The husband was in the garage, fiddling with a car engine, but his attention was drawn by the men's arrival. He watched from the corner of his eye as they approached the house, their stiff postures and deliberate pace raising an unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach. One of the men knocked on the door, and his wife answered. She stepped out onto the porch, her warm smile still intact, though something in her eyes flickered for just a moment as she noticed their stern expressions. The man in front, tall with a sharp jawline, presented a clipboard and gave a curt nod. "Good morning, ma'am. We are with the Homeowners Association. We need to discuss some violations we've noticed on your property." At first, it seemed like any other HOA inspection. The neighborhood had its rules, after all, rules about fence height, paint colors, lawn maintenance, the kind of things that were always nagging at homeowners, but rarely serious enough to escalate into anything. But there was something off about the way they spoke, the sharpness in their tone. They weren't here to discuss, not really. Their eyes were scanning the house with an intensity that didn't belong in a neighborhood meeting. They were here with an agenda. The wife listened patiently as they rattled off a list of supposed violations. An overgrown bush by the front door, a missing house number, a slight chip in the paint along the trim. The trivialities were almost laughable, but the way the men approached each point was anything but casual. They were demanding. Their voices never wavered, and they made it clear that her compliance wasn't a suggestion. "You'll need to fix these immediately, or we'll be forced to take further action," the taller man said, his voice cutting through the air like a threat. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her eyes never lost their steady warmth, but there was something beneath the surface, a quiet authority that didn't belong in a suburban setting like this one. She tilted her head slightly as though weighing the situation with calm detachment. her hands folded neatly in front of her. She gave a soft smile and responded with a calmness that could only be described as practiced. "I'll take care of it," she said, her voice polite, almost soothing. There was no sign of panic, no indication that she was rattled in the least. But the longer she spoke to them, the more it became clear that her calmness was not an act of mere politeness. There was something in the way she measured each word, each gesture. It was as if she was already planning her next move, sizing up the situation in a way that felt eerily deliberate. When one of the men stepped forward, leaning in just a little too close, her posture shifted ever so slightly. Her hand brushed against the railing, fingertips tracing the smooth surface, almost as if she were looking for something, or waiting for it to come to her. The husband, still watching from the garage, couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but something in his gut told him this wasn't just about overgrown bushes or a chipped paint job. The way his wife stood there, unruffled, unshaken, spoke volumes. She wasn't afraid of these men. In fact, she was almost indifferent. And that was when he felt it, the strange, gnawing sensation that he had just seen a glimpse of someone he didn't quite know. The wife had never been one to share much about her past, and for good reason. What most people didn't know was that her life had been anything but ordinary. She hadn't always been the quiet, unassuming woman tending to her garden and sharing coffee with neighbors. Once she had been someone else entirely, someone who lived in shadows, moving between cities and countries, her every step calculated and deliberate. She had been a CIA operative for over a decade, trained in some of the most dangerous and covert operations imaginable. Her expertise wasn't just in gathering intelligence. She was skilled in negotiation, infiltration, and, when necessary, extraction. Her training had been rigorous, grueling even, but it had shaped her into someone capable of handling the highest pressure situations. The fieldwork had taken her to places most people only read about in news reports, where one wrong move could end in disaster. But for her, it was a game of keeping one step ahead, of knowing when to fight and when to disappear. But those days were behind her now. She had left the agency, walked away from it all, seeking the kind of peace that only an ordinary life could offer. The decision had been hers, a conscious choice to leave the chaos of the intelligence world behind and settle into the simplicity of suburban life. She had wanted a fresh start, to shed the layers of her former identity and embrace something quieter. Her husband knew none of this. He only saw the woman who made him laugh and shared late-night talks under the stars. To him, she was just his wife, the woman who baked cookies and loved cats. But the past doesn't stay buried forever, especially when you've lived a life as complex and dangerous as hers. The skills she'd honed over the years, things she had learned in places far from this sleepy neighborhood, had never truly faded. They were etched into her being, part of her DNA. She had learned to read people in ways others couldn't. She understood the subtle shifts in a room, the micro-expressions that told more than words ever could. And there was always the network, an intricate web of former colleagues, allies, and friends who had served alongside her in the shadows. Some of them were still active, others long retired, but they all shared a bond forged through years of dangerous operations. They had been the ones who helped her disappear when she needed to, the ones who kept an eye on things when she took a step back from the world she had known. They were her backup, always just a call away, ready to assist when things went wrong. She knew their skills as well as her own. Hackers who could break into any system, operatives who could blend into any environment, strategists who could plan a mission in their sleep. Even in her quiet life, the network remained, a silent, watchful presence in the background, one that had saved her life more than once. She kept the contact information hidden, tucked away in a place only she could reach, just in case. And it wasn't a matter of paranoia, it was a necessity. She'd been trained to never fully trust anyone, even in the most mundane of circumstances. The world she had once been a part of didn't just disappear because she wanted it to. And though she had left that world behind, it was always there, lurking in the corners, ready to pull her back in if needed. She had hoped, of course, that she would never have to use those connections again, that the life she had built with her husband would remain untouched by the dark world she had escaped. But as the moments on the porch unfolded, as the fake HOA officers stood before her with their hidden agenda, she knew something was about to change. The past, it seemed, had finally caught up with her. The air around them seemed to tighten as the two men pressed in, their posture shifting from professional to something more insistent. What had started as a routine, albeit strange, HOA visit had quickly morphed into something much more serious. The taller officer, who had been holding the clipboard with a feigned calmness, now stepped closer, his hand twitching ever so slightly towards his belt. The other man, shorter but more wiry, narrowed his eyes, scanning the porch as if looking for something to latch onto. "We're not here to argue, ma'am," the taller man said, his voice colder now, edged with impatience. "This is a matter of compliance. You need to address these violations immediately, or we'll have no choice but to escalate." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. The wife's smile didn't falter, but the shift in her demeanor was unmistakable. Her stance remained open, but her eyes flickered briefly toward the corner of the porch, where a small decorative pot sat on the railing. To anyone else, it would seem like a casual glance, a passing moment. But for those who knew her, it was a signal, a subtle, nearly imperceptible gesture. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the pot just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. It was a silent cue, one that would not go unnoticed by those who had been trained to observe the smallest details. The men, unaware of the network that had always surrounded her, pressed on. "We'll be reporting you to the city if this isn't taken care of right now," the shorter man added, his voice hardening. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the porch, his shadow falling across her like a looming threat. "You'll be receiving a fine, and you'll be expected to comply, or there will be consequences." There was something about his tone that triggered an alarm in the husband's mind, though he couldn't quite place it. He'd been listening to the conversation from the garage, his hands frozen on the wrench in his grip. Something felt wrong. The way these men were speaking, the way they were encroaching on his wife's space. He felt the knot in his stomach tighten, the feeling that this was no ordinary HOA visit. But he couldn't figure out what exactly they were after. The wife didn't seem threatened, not even slightly. She remained calm, her voice as smooth as ever. "I'll take care of it," she repeated, her words almost too calm, too collected. "I'll be sure to have it all sorted out by the end of the day. You don't need to worry." But her eyes had shifted again, and this time, the husband caught it, the smallest flicker, almost imperceptible, but there. She wasn't just pacifying them, she was waiting. She was calculating her next move, and there was an unspoken assurance in her posture, like she had everything under control. The taller man wasn't buying it. He stepped closer, now standing only inches from her, his voice low, menacing. "We're not leaving until we see action, ma'am. You understand?" The wife didn't back away. Instead, she met his gaze directly, the soft smile still in place, but there was a quiet power behind her eyes that stopped him in his tracks. Her fingers, which had been gently caressing the edge of the pot, moved just enough to brush against something hidden beneath it, a small, innocuous-looking device, nearly invisible to the naked eye. In the blink of an eye, the tension in the air shifted. The moment had arrived, and the wife's subtle signal had been sent. As if on cue, the quiet hum of a nearby phone buzzed twice, a signal that had been set up long ago, a simple notification that was a lifeline if ever needed. The husband still didn't understand fully, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something was happening. He had seen his wife face stressful situations before, but this was different. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation. She had already planned for this, even if he hadn't been part of that plan. His confusion deepened as the fake HOA officers stood just a little too still, their expressions hardening as if they too had sensed the change in the atmosphere. They were no longer in control. They had underestimated her, but they were about to realize their mistake. The wife's fingers remained still on the device for a split second longer, and then, almost imperceptibly, the sound of distant sirens began to echo down the street, growing louder with each passing second. It was a quiet warning, but the message was clear. Whatever game they were playing, it was over now. The sudden wail of sirens, growing louder by the second, had the fake HOA officers momentarily pausing, their eyes darting nervously toward the street. The wife's fingers remained steady on the small device, her calm demeanor unbroken as she waited, every moment drawn tight with anticipation. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to be cut with a knife. Before either of the men could react, the sound of multiple vehicles screeching to a halt in front of the house sent a shiver of alarm through them. It wasn't just one car, it was an entire convoy, a small fleet of black SUVs with tinted windows, their tires screeching against the asphalt as they slammed to a stop in perfect, coordinated synchronization. The unmistakable presence of federal agents was enough to send a wave of shock through the imposters. As the doors of the SUVs flung open, agents in full tactical gear poured out, their movements sharp and precise. They fanned out in seconds, taking control of the scene with military precision. The two fake HOA officers froze, their confusion turning quickly into panic as they realized they were being surrounded. The tall officer, who had been so sure of his control just moments before, now found himself thrust against the side of the porch. His hands were jerked behind him, cuffs snapping into place with an authoritative click. The shorter officer attempted to resist, but the agents were too fast, their movements too practiced. Within moments, he too was subdued, his attempts at escape futile as he was slammed to the ground. The husband stood frozen in the garage, his mind scrambling to catch up with the rapid turn of events. He hadn't seen the agents, not clearly, but the speed at which they had taken control of the situation left him no doubt. These were no ordinary law enforcement officers. The way they moved, the way they commanded the scene, told him that this was bigger than a simple HOA dispute. It was only now that he realized the depth of what was happening. The wife remained on the porch, her gaze unfazed as the agents swarmed around her. She hadn't moved an inch, her presence as serene as ever. But her eyes, those eyes were alert, calculating, a silent command to the agents still processing the scene. One of the agents, a tall man with a buzz cut, approached her slowly, his eyes scanning her face as though confirming something. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his voice low but filled with a quiet respect. The wife nodded, her hands folding neatly in front of her, as if she were simply another suburban homeowner who had just endured an unfortunate misunderstanding. To anyone watching, she seemed completely unaffected by the chaos unfolding around her. Behind the scenes, however, she was anything but passive. Every agent knew their role, their every move choreographed to perfection. The wife had coordinated this operation down to the smallest detail, ensuring that each agent was in the right position at exactly the right time. She had orchestrated the intervention from the moment she realized that the so-called HOA officers were far from legitimate. This wasn't just an unassuming suburban confrontation. It was an operation that had been years in the making, a careful balance of preparation and precise execution. As the imposters were swiftly cuffed and dragged to their knees, one of the agents stepped forward to address the husband, who had finally emerged from the garage, still in a daze. "Sir, we need to ask you to step back. We're going to handle this from here." The husband blinked, trying to process the surreal scene unfolding in front of him. His wife, standing so composed amid the whirlwind of federal agents and subdued criminals, had been the calm in the eye of the storm. She had been the one pulling the strings all along, orchestrating the entire operation while hiding in plain sight. And he was just beginning to understand that the woman he thought he knew had been living a double life. The federal agents continued to move swiftly, taking charge of the situation. They began interrogating the two fake HOA officers, whose faces were now a mixture of confusion and fear, their false identities crumbling with each question. The wife observed from the porch, her role still largely invisible to her husband, though the tension in her posture remained. She was giving orders with the smallest of gestures, her eyes locking onto key agents to signal next steps. It was a language he didn't understand, but one that was second nature to her. As the agents secured the area, their actions no longer in question, it became clear that the imposter's presence had been a deliberate tactic in a much larger game. The husband had yet to grasp the full extent of it, but the agents did, and the wife's subtle involvement was evident in their every move. She had set this in motion, ensured that the right team was in place, And now they were on the cusp of uncovering the truth behind the orchestrated plot that had brought these men to their doorstep. But for now, the most important thing was that the threat had been neutralized, and it was only a matter of time before the real story would unfold. As the dust settled and the last of the fake HOA officers were hauled away by federal agents, the air in the suburban neighborhood felt oddly still. The chaos of the morning had subsided, but the questions still lingered. What had brought these men to the doorstep of an ordinary suburban home? Why had they chosen this moment, this family, to make their move? As the agents began their investigation, it became clear that the truth ran far deeper than anyone had imagined. The initial assumption had been that the men were simply out to extort money, perhaps with fake fines or threats. It was a common tactic used by scammers, and it would have been easy to dismiss them as nothing more than petty criminals. But the wife, she knew better. She had seen this kind of operation before. She recognized the signs, the subtle manipulations that went beyond what any simple con artist could pull off. This was deliberate, calculated, and it was personal. As the federal agents began to question the detained men, their stories began to unravel. The tall officer, the one who had tried to intimidate the wife on the porch, cracked first. His tough exterior fell apart under the pressure, his voice faltering as he realized the game was over. His association with the HOA had been fabricated. There was no organization behind him, no official paperwork, nothing that tied him to any legitimate operation. He was merely a pawn in a much larger scheme. The agent interrogating him leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Who sent you?" he asked, his voice cold. The man hesitated and then, with a bitter laugh, he spoke. "You think this is about a damn HOA? You've got no idea what you're up against. We were just the first wave." The agent's eyes flicked toward the wife, who had remained silent, her calm eyes now sharp with focus. She had been listening intently, her mind already piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. The words, "first wave," echoed in her mind. This was bigger than a few fake inspectors. The operation she had just dismantled was part of something far more insidious, something that tied directly back to her. Her network, her allies, had already been alert to the threat, but now it was clear that whoever had been pulling the strings was targeting more than just her. They were going after her entire history, every connection she had ever made in her covert world. Her involvement in intelligence had never been fully erased, no matter how hard she tried to bury it. Someone had figured out who she was, and they had decided that she was a liability that needed to be eliminated, along with anyone close to her. The agents continued their questioning, but the wife's thoughts had already shifted. She knew there were higher forces at play, forces who had been watching her for far longer than she'd realized. The truth behind the fake HOA officers wasn't just about silencing her. It was about something much darker, a larger conspiracy that had now moved into her personal life. Whoever was orchestrating this had access to an unimaginable amount of resources. They weren't just targeting a former CIA operative. They were targeting her family, her future. Her eyes hardened, the quiet determination settling into her bones. She had spent years building a life with her husband, a life that was supposed to be free from the dangerous shadows of her past. But now the past had come rushing back, and she wasn't going to let it tear apart everything she had worked for. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop with a few fake HOA officers. They would be back, and when they did, they would come with everything they had. But she was ready. She'd been trained for moments like this, moments where everything hung in the balance. This was her life now. Her family was her responsibility, and she would protect them at all costs. As the agents moved forward with their investigation, one of them pulled her aside, his voice low but urgent. "We've got leads on a larger operation. This is just the beginning. We need you to stay with us. Work with us on this." She glanced at her husband, who was still trying to piece everything together in his mind. He was still in the dark about her past, still clueless about the gravity of what was unfolding around them. Her heart twisted for a moment. She hadn't wanted this life for him, but it seemed there was no turning back now. With a firm nod, she met the agent's gaze. "I'll help you, but we do this my way." She didn't wait for a response. Her mind was already racing ahead, formulating a plan. She needed to get ahead of this before it consumed everything she had built. She had the experience, the knowledge, and the connections. She could track the roots of this conspiracy down to the core. But this time, she wasn't going in alone. This time, she had more to protect than just herself. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to settle back into its usual rhythm. The fake HOA officers had been hauled off, their false identities exposed, but the ripples of their actions were far from over. The federal agents worked tirelessly to trace the origins of the operation, peeling back layers of deception, uncovering a network of individuals tied to shadowy organizations with ties to both criminal enterprises and private mercenary groups. The HOA scam was just the surface. Beneath it, they found evidence of a much larger web of manipulation and surveillance, all designed to track down former agents, operatives, and anyone connected to the intelligence community. The two men who had been apprehended were far from insignificant pawns in a larger game. They were connected to a powerful faction, one that had access to resources, technology, and influence that extended far beyond anything the protagonist had ever imagined. The agents quickly learned that the fake HOA officers were simply a front, sent in to gauge the situation, assess vulnerabilities, and make their move when the time was right. But the wife's swift reaction had turned the tables, leaving the would-be assailants scrambling and their handlers scrambling to cover their tracks. For now, the immediate danger had passed, but the repercussions were just beginning. As the investigation unfolded, law enforcement uncovered that the fake officers were only one small piece of a much larger operation. With every step forward, the wife learned that her decision to leave the CIA hadn't severed all her ties to the world she thought she had left behind. These men were just the latest in a long line of threats she would need to face. The exposure of her identity was only the beginning of the fallout. Whoever was pulling the strings, whoever had orchestrated this far-reaching conspiracy, would be watching her every move from now on. The impact of these events stretched beyond the professional sphere. It touched her family in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Her husband, once blissfully unaware of her past, was left to grapple with the truth in the aftermath. The man who had once seen his wife as the gentle, quiet woman who made dinner and laughed at bad jokes now found himself standing beside a woman he didn't fully understand. The weight of the revelations hung heavy between them, like an invisible barrier that neither knew how to cross. For her part, the wife did everything she could to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She cooked dinner, she watered the plants, she smiled at the neighbors, just as she had done before. But the cracks in that facade were beginning to show. She had grown accustomed to the tension of secrecy, to carrying the burden of a past that could never truly be erased. But now it was different. She wasn't just hiding from old enemies. She was trying to protect the one person who had never asked to be part of her world. As the days wore on, her husband couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. There were moments when he caught her staring out the window, her mind seemingly 1,000 miles away. Other times, he noticed the subtle shifts in her behavior, how she always checked the locks before bed, how her eyes darted to the street whenever a car slowed down outside. He didn't ask questions, not yet. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. But the unease was growing, a quiet tension that neither of them could escape. The wife's resolve remained strong, but her mind was never far from the events that had unfolded. She had faced threats before, had dealt with danger on a scale most people could never imagine. But this time was different. The stakes were higher. Her family was now part of the equation. And the thought of them being drawn into the shadows of her past made her stomach turn. And then, just as she thought they might catch a break, a message came through. A simple text, the kind that made her blood run cold. "We know where you are. We know what you've been hiding. You can't run forever." The words were chilling in their simplicity, but the threat was clear. It wasn't over. Whoever had been behind the attack, whoever had been hunting her for years, was still out there. And this time, they weren't just threatening her. They were threatening everything she had worked to protect. Her heart raced as she stared at the screen. There would be no escaping this. She had made a promise to herself and to her family, and now it was time to follow through. But this time, she would be more prepared, more vigilant. The peace she had tried to build, the life she had tried to protect, it was fragile, and the shadows of her past weren't going to let it remain untouched for long. The wife glanced over at her husband, who was seated at the kitchen table, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. She had spent years keeping him out of it, but the world she had left behind was now knocking at their door, and she knew deep down that the time had come for him to understand just how much she had sacrificed to keep them safe. There was no going back. The game had shifted, and the stakes had never been higher. But as she read the text again, her mind snapped into focus. She had been in worse situations before. She had always found a way out, and this time, she wouldn't let anyone, no one, destroy the life they had built. The days after the threat had subsided were filled with a delicate balance. The wife did everything she could to restore some semblance of normalcy to their lives, but it was clear that nothing would ever be the same. She kept up the appearances, cooking breakfast, tending to the garden, making small talk with the neighbors. But the tension in the air was thick, and the weight of it pressed on her every move. The family's morning routine was still in place, a familiar rhythm that had once been a comfort. The husband went to work, the kids got ready for school, and the wife performed her duties as though nothing had changed. On the surface, everything appeared just like it always had, but underneath, a constant undercurrent of anxiety ran through the household. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond the horizon, waiting. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar car passing by, made her heart race. Her mind was always alert, always watching, scanning for any sign of danger. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, a rare moment of quiet settled over them. The kids chatted about their day, oblivious to the tension that clung to the walls. The husband smiled at his wife, trying to keep things light, to keep things normal. "How was your day?" he asked, trying to draw her into the conversation. The question, so innocent, hit her like a wave. She froze, her fork suspended midair. Her husband's gaze was warm, kind, but she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He was still trying to make sense of everything, of her past, of the events that had unfolded. He didn't know the half of it. "Just another day," she replied, her voice steady, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She pushed a bite of food into her mouth to mask the brief hesitation. The normalcy she had worked so hard to preserve felt fragile, slipping away with each passing moment. Every word she said felt like a carefully constructed performance, a charade that she wasn't sure how much longer she could maintain. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she immediately stiffened. Her hand moved instinctively, reaching for it before anyone could notice. The screen lit up with a message from an encrypted number. The message was short, cryptic, and to the point. "Stay vigilant. They're watching." Her breath caught in her throat. She had known the peace wouldn't last, but seeing it in black and white was a sharp reminder of just how close the danger was. She could feel her heart thudding against her ribs, but she didn't let it show. With a slow, controlled motion, she placed the phone back down, trying to mask the unease that had suddenly taken over her body. "Everything okay?" her husband asked, noticing the sudden shift in her posture. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, searching her face. She smiled, a tight, practiced expression. "Just tired, I guess. It's been a long day." He didn't push. He never did. She was grateful for that, though part of her wished he would. She wished he would ask the right questions, demand to know what was going on, force her to share the burden she carried. But she knew that would only make things worse. He wasn't ready for that, not yet. Later, after the kids had gone to bed, the house fell into a quiet stillness. The wife moved through the rooms methodically, checking the locks on every door, ensuring every window was secure. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a trap. She tried to remind herself that everything was fine, that they were safe, for now, but the nagging feeling of being watched never left. Then came the soft, familiar hum of her secure phone vibrating on the counter. She approached it slowly, her mind already calculating her next move. She unlocked the device and read the new message. "Backup is in place. We've got you covered. Stay low." The reassurance was welcome, but it only underscored how much she had to rely on those she had kept at arm's length for so long. Her network, her old colleagues, her fellow operatives, people who had once been just shadows in her life, were now her lifeline. They were the only ones who could keep her safe, keep her family safe. They understood the stakes, the unspoken code that bound them. They were watching her 6, and that was the only thing that kept her grounded in this sea of uncertainty. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging slightly in relief. She wasn't alone in this, not yet at least, but the line between her old world and her new life was growing increasingly thin, and she was constantly walking a tightrope, trying not to fall. Her husband came into the room, his face soft in the dim light. "You okay?" he asked again, his voice quieter this time. She met his eyes, her heart aching for the life they had once had. She wanted to tell him everything, to finally tear down the walls that kept her from him. But she couldn't. Not yet. There were too many risks, too many unknowns. So instead, she smiled, this time with more sincerity, and nodded. "I'm fine, just tired." He studied her for a moment longer, before offering her a gentle smile. "Okay, but if you need to talk, you know I'm here." Her heart clenched and she nodded again, grateful for the simple gesture of support. He didn't know what she was hiding, but he was still trying to be there for her. That was enough for now. As he turned to leave, she stood there in the silence, feeling the weight of her past and present pressing down on her. She had built a life that was good, a life worth protecting, but the shadows were always just around the corner, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't outrun them, not completely. Her phone buzzed again, and she took a breath, steeling herself for whatever came next. The life she had fought for was still hers to protect. But the game was far from over. The days of relative calm were quickly fading, replaced by the sharp, unyielding clarity of preparation. The wife knew that their window of peace was closing, and in its place a storm was brewing. She had seen this before, threats lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. This time, however, the stakes were much higher. Her family was no longer just a passive part of her life. They were now targets in a game she had tried to leave behind, and she would not let them become casualties of her past. She spent hours in the basement, the hum of the fluorescent lights above her blending into the quiet focus that had consumed her every thought. Plans were already forming, strategies taking shape. She mapped out every possible scenario, every road of escape, every weak point that could be exploited. Every inch of her home, every corner of their lives had to be fortified against the unknown. It was a meticulous process, one that required more than just physical preparation. It demanded psychological resilience. Her family would need to stay strong, stay vigilant, even if they didn't fully understand what was happening. In one corner of the basement, a stack of old equipment gathered dust, a mix of tactical gear, surveillance tools, and training manuals. These were relics of her past life, reminders of the world she had once inhabited. She had walked away from it all, but she could no longer afford that luxury. The world had a way of pulling you back in, especially when you least expected it. The first order of business was training. She had to be ready, and her allies, the ones she trusted most, needed to be prepared as well. They weren't just ex-colleagues anymore. They were the front line, the only ones who could help her protect the life she had rebuilt. Her trusted few had already been informed, discreetly, of the situation. They understood what was at stake, and they were willing to step back into the fray, even if it meant dusting off their own training. She began with the basics, teaching them how to move silently, how to think 2 steps ahead. The garage became a makeshift training ground, filled with the sounds of boots on concrete, sharp commands, and the thud of practice strikes. The drills were intense, and the focus was razor sharp. She didn't give them room to slack off, pushing them to their limits with each passing day. It wasn't just about learning how to fight. It was about regaining the mindset of survival, to be prepared for anything, even the most unexpected of threats. In one session, she had her most trusted ally, a former field agent, take the lead, running a counter-surveillance exercise. The two of them went over the neighborhood, blending in with the crowds, using the skills she had honed over the years to scan for potential danger. Her mind was always working, assessing angles, calculating risks. It was second nature to her now, but she could see her ally beginning to catch on. With each drill, they were learning to think like her, to act like her. And that was exactly what they needed. There were moments, though, when doubt crept in. As she trained, as she shared her knowledge, she couldn't help but wonder if she was asking too much of them. They hadn't lived the life she had, hadn't experienced the threats, the betrayals, the constant pressure of being watched. This wasn't just about physical preparedness. It was about mental endurance, and she wasn't sure if anyone could truly be ready for the world they were about to re-enter. But there was no time to waste on uncertainty. The threats were too real, and the clock was ticking. Every hour spent preparing was an hour closer to the storm that was coming. She knew it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about her family. Every action, every decision had to be calculated with their safety in mind. Late one night, after a particularly grueling session, she found herself alone in the basement, the echoes of the day still reverberating in her mind. She stood in front of the mirror, her reflection showing the stark lines of exhaustion on her face. But beneath the fatigue, there was a fire that had been rekindled, a fire that burned brighter than ever before. She wasn't just preparing for herself anymore. She was preparing for the unknown, for the challenges that would come, for the future she had to protect. A knock on the basement door broke her focus. It was one of her allies, a quiet reminder that the work didn't stop. She nodded, signaling for him to come in. He handed her a tablet, the screen filled with an update from their network. The message was brief, but it sent a chill down her spine. "They're getting closer. We need to move fast." Her mind shifted into overdrive. The game had changed. There would be no more waiting, no more playing it safe. They were no longer on the defensive. They were preparing for war. "Set up the next phase," she said, her voice steady. "We go dark. No more mistakes." Her ally nodded, leaving as quietly as he had entered. She was already formulating the next step in her plan, weighing every possible angle, every contingency. She could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of what was to come. She knew deep down that this was only the beginning. But for the first time in years, she felt ready. Ready to face whatever came next. The training would continue. The plans would evolve. But now more than ever, she understood that they weren't just preparing for the inevitable. They were preparing for something even greater, something that would change everything. The countdown had begun, and with it, the weight of the challenge that lay ahead. As the sun set over the quiet suburban neighborhood, the protagonist stood at the edge of her porch, looking out over the peaceful streets. The world around her seemed so ordinary. Families returning home, children playing in the yards, the sound of distant laughter drifting on the breeze. It was the kind of life most people dreamed of. Safe, predictable, uncomplicated. But as the shadows grew longer, she couldn't shake the sense of duality that had come to define her existence. The woman standing here, in this quiet suburban street, was not just a wife, a mother, or a neighbor. She was someone else entirely, someone shaped by experiences that most people could never begin to imagine. The balance between the life she had chosen and the one she had been forced to leave behind was tenuous, fragile, and yet it was the one she had built. Her past, her time as a CIA operative, the covert operations, the lies, the constant danger, was never truly behind her. It was woven into her very being, etched into her muscle memory, and embedded in the choices she made every single day. The skills, the mindset, the instincts she had honed over years of high-stakes espionage weren't something she could simply shed, even if she tried. They were part of her now, a constant undercurrent that flowed just beneath the surface, waiting to rise up when necessary. Yet here she was, in a life she had fought so hard to create. A life filled with ordinary moments, mundane tasks, and simple joys. Cooking dinner with her husband, watching her kids grow, tending to the garden. These were the things that grounded her, that allowed her to momentarily forget the weight of her past. But that peace was always fleeting, always interrupted by the creeping awareness that her past was never truly gone. It was a ghost, an ever-present reminder that her life would never be as simple as it seemed. This tension, the push and pull between the two worlds, was her reality. It wasn't something she could resolve or escape. It was the essence of who she had become and the price of the choices she had made. It was the delicate dance of resilience and adaptation, of learning to live with contradictions. She was both the woman who sat at the dinner table, laughing with her family, and the woman who had trained in the shadows, ready to do whatever it took to survive. She was both the mother who kissed her children goodnight and the operative who had faced death more times than she cared to remember. And in that, there was a quiet strength, a resilience born not from the absence of fear, but from the ability to live alongside it, to embrace the complexity of identity, of being more than one thing, and to still move forward day by day. Her adaptability was not just about surviving, it was about thriving. In the spaces between those worlds, finding a way to balance both the extraordinary and the ordinary, the danger and the peace. It wasn't easy. Sometimes it felt like she was living in two parallel realities that would never truly align. The woman who smiled at the neighbors was the same woman who had faced threats that could never be fully explained. The wife who tucked her children into bed was the same woman who had once orchestrated operations that would never see the light of day. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps that was what it meant to live a full life, to carry both the darkness and the light, to understand the complexities of identity, and to still move forward with purpose. The world was filled with people who walked through life in a singular, uncomplicated direction, never having to look over their shoulder, never questioning who they were beneath the surface. But for her, the intersections of ordinary life and extraordinary circumstances were unavoidable. They shaped her, defined her. And it was in the space between those two realities where she found her true strength. As the night deepened, she turned away from the porch, a sense of resolve settling in. She didn't have all the answers, didn't know what the future would bring, but she understood this. Life was messy, complicated, and unpredictable. The key wasn't in trying to escape the challenges or the shadows of the past. It was in learning how to move forward with both, to embrace the duality, to find peace not by running from the complexities of who she was, but by accepting them as part of her journey. Because in the end, it was the intersection of those two worlds, ordinary and extraordinary, that made her who she was. And that was enough.